Welcome to Live Daf, your online Daf Yomi Shiur.
Shalom Aleichem and welcome back to today's Daf Yomi, which is Shabbos Daf Kuf Lamed Beis. We're on Daf Kuf Lamed Aleph Amud Beis, 2 lines from the bottom. Says the Gemara, Amar Mar, we learned earlier, Mila v'chol machshireha, Mila, and all of its accessories, all the preparations for the Bris Milah as well, are doichen as HaShabbos, negate Shabbos, they override Shabbos, Divei Rabbi Lezer. Says the Gemara, Minale, the Rabbi Lezer, how does Rabbi Lezer know that not only the Milah itself is Doicha Shabbos, but the preparations as well are Doicha Shabbos? I mikulu gamar, can we say perhaps that he will learn the machshirim of Milah from the other mitzvahs we had? Oimer shtei alechem, each one has its own makor, its own source, that the machshirim are Doicha Shabbos. Perhaps Rabbi Lezer will derive the machshirim, the preparation of the Bris Milah, from one of those mitzvahs. Says Mar, we cannot do that. Kedam rinan, as we said earlier, that each one of them has a stringency, something which is unique about it, and therefore we cannot go ahead and learn something else from those things. V'oid, in addition, malahanach shekeinim avar zmano batla. These things are unique. The oimer shtei alechem, all these mitzvahs are unique because if their zman was avar, if their time passes, batla, it's batla. They're all time sensitive, time dependent, as opposed to milah. Even though we were meant to do it on the 8th day, but if the time passes, you can still go ahead and do the milah afterwards. So perhaps it doesn't justify to go ahead and do the machshirim on Shabbos. Says more Elo hainu taimad Rabbi Lezer. This is the reason for Rabbi Lezer's chiddush that the machshirim of milah adecha Shabbos da makra, because the pasuk says uvayoyim hashmini, on the 8th day yimoil b'sar alasai. So they should do milah on the basar of the arla. The word uvayoyim seems to be an extra word, and it's coming to teach us va'afilu b'Shabbos. Even on Shabbos, one may do the machshirim. Now, how do we know what's going on the machshirim? It says Rashi, because the actual milah itself, the bris itself, is Doicha Shabbos based on a halacha Moshe Messinai, as the Gemara will mention soon. So apparently, this extra word uvayoyim, which is coming to include Shabbos as well, is going to be applied to the preparations, to the machshirim of milah, and indeed, this is the source for Rabbi Lezer. Says the Gemara, if so, v'lichtav rachmanu b'milah. Why can the Torah simply write this halacha that the machshirim are Doicha Shabbos by the mitzvah of milah? And the other ones, oimer shtei alechem, sukkah, all those can simply learn, derive from Bris Milah. Why do we need separate psukim in all those areas? Says the Gemara, because we can go ahead and refute and draw a line between milah and all the other mitzvahs, because milah is outstanding. Mala milah shekei nichersu aleh shleishes brisais. We find that when it comes to milah, there were 13 brisais, 13 covenants, 13 bonds, which were applied to Bris Milah, which Bris Milah entails, as Rashi brings that in the Parsha of Milah, with Avram Avinu. There is the mentioning of the word bris 13 times. So since bris is so unique that it contains all these 13 mentionings of bris, 13 different aspects of bris, so perhaps you cannot go ahead and derive the other mitzvahs from Bris Milah. Therefore, each mitzvah needs its own source, its own limud, to teach us that the machshir in the preparation of the mitzvahs of Doicha Shabbos. Continues the Gemara, Ad kan li pligi, Rabbanon alei. We only find that the Rabbanon disagree with Rabbi Lezer, Ela machshir milah, only with regard to the preparation of the milah, whether or not it's Doicha Shabbos. Rabbi Lezer says yes, Rabbanon say no. Aval milah gufa, but the actual Bris Milah itself, Divrei HaKod Doicha Shabbos, all agree that it overrides Shabbos. One goes ahead and does the milah bismana we're speaking on the 8th day. He certainly does it on Shabbos. Minolan, how do we know that? From where do we learn this halacha? Amar Ula halacha. It's actually halacha Moshe Sinai, received by Moshe from Har Sinai. It's Torah Shebal Peh, the oral Torah. V'chein Rabbi Yitzchak halacha meisvei v'braisa, which seems to indicate that no, it cannot be that it is based on halacha Moshe Sinai. The Braisa says as follows: Menayin lepikuach nefesh. How do we know that for the sake of saving one's life, one may do a malacha, menayin lepikuach nefesh shedoichas haShabbos? It overrides Shabbos. Rabbi Lezer ben Azariah Omer. We learn it from a Kal V'chomer, from a Bris Milah. Ma milah. If we find that milah, since milah, which is only she'achas me'ivarish of Adam, which only pertains to one limb of a person, is only be mesak and only benefits one aver of a person. Nevertheless, doiches haShabbos, we find that the milah itself is doiches Shabbos. Kal V'chomer certainly lepikuach nefesh, to to do a malacha for the sake of saving one's entire body and so entire life. Certainly that justifies Chilul Shabbos. Certainly the Kavachayim Pekuach Nefesh Shadoiches HaShabbos. So we derive Pekuach Nefesh from Bris Milah. Now, if you maintain that halach, that the reason why we do Bris Milah on Shabbos, it's based on halacha Moshe Sinai, which is Torah Shabbat Peh. Can one derive a halacha through the formula of Kavachayim from a halacha Moshe Sinai? Can we apply a Kavachayim to Torah Shabbat Peh? V'atanya, we learned in a brisa, which tells us very clearly that we cannot go ahead and apply a Kavachayim reasoning when we are basing it on something which is Torah Shabbat Peh. Kavachayim only applies to something which is written, the written word, the written Torah. V'atani, we learned in the Brisa. Amar loy, Rabbi Lezer ben Azariah, Akiva. So Rabbi Lezer turned to Rabbi Akiva, he said, how can you go ahead? Rabbi Akiva is learning regarding a nazir that we know that a nazir who accepted upon himself a vow not to drink wine, not to become tamei. So if he becomes tamei, then he goes ahead and he terminates his nazirus. He has to shave and megalech and start the nazirus all over again. So Rabbi Akiva was deriving the halacha regarding revius of dam. If there's a revius of blood, of a mace, and the nazir comes into contact with it, his nazirus terminates. How do we know that? So Rabbi Akiva said, well, a kavachaymer. We know that an etzem kesoira, if we have a piece of bone the size of a barley, etzem of a mace, and the nazir comes into contact with it, we know from halacha Moshe Sinai, that the nazir terminates his nazirus and needs to start all over again. Says Rabbi Akiva, we're going to learn out through a kavachaymer that halacha applies to a revius dam as well. You have an amount of a revius of dam, blood of a mace. There too, if the nazir comes into contact with it, his nazirus terminates. So we're applying a kavachaymer to the revius dam and learning it from the halacha of etzem kesoira, which is really based on halacha Moshe Sinai. And Rashi brings the kavachaymer, which is that since we find that if a nazir touches that small bone, he terminates his nazirus, although the etzem kesoira is limited. It's limited in its ability to be matame. It's only matame b'maga or b'masa if one touches it or carries it. Nevertheless, it has that power to shut down the nazirus. Certainly the dam, revius dam, which has the ability generally to be matame, not only b'maga, through contact, masa, through lifting, through carrying, it also is matame b'oil. If it's found together with a person under the same roof, it is generally matame the person, so it has more ability to impart tumah. So certainly, of course, if we find that the etzem could affect the nazir, certainly the dam should have the ability to affect the nazir. So Rabbi Lezer responded to that. Amar Rabbi Lezer Razai, Akiva, etzem kesoira matame halacha. How do we know that etzem kesoira is matame a person? How do we know that the etzem kesoira is matame a nazir to the extent that his nazirus terminates? How do we know that? From halacha Moshe Sinai. Revius dam kavachaymer, and a revius dam you're trying to learn from there through a kavachaymer. Ve'ein donen kavachaymer malach. We cannot derive, we cannot apply a kavachaymer to halacha Moshe Sinai. As Rashi says, halacha Moshe Sinai is Torah Shabbat Peh, it's oral Torah, and those formulas, those Yud Gimel Midos, different types of ways of learning things, derivations, including kavachaymer, can only be applied to something which is Torah Shebechsav. So that's Rabbi Lezer Azai's response to Rabbi Akiva. Ein donen kavachaymer mahalacha. So likewise, in our sugya, how can you say that Mila Bizmana, the halacha that Mila overrides Shabbos, is learned from halacha Moshe Sinai? If so, how can the Brisa suggest that we will derive from this halacha to the other halacha of Pikuach Nefesh, is the Shabbos, and that will be done through using a kavachaymer formula, basing it on the halacha Moshe Sinai? If we find that Mila is the Shabbos, which is halacha Moshe Sinai, certainly Pikuach Nefesh, saving an entire person, can be the Shabbos. You cannot apply kavachaymer to halacha Moshe Sinai. Elamar Belezer, apparently the source for Mila overriding Shabbos is another one, is a different source, a Torah Shebechsav source. Asya ois ois, we apply Gzeir Shava. The Torah uses the word ois by Shabbos it says l'deroisam oisi le'olam, and by Bris Milah it says v'haya la'ois bris. So we apply the concept of Zer Shava, and we say just as the pasuk by Shabbos oisi le'olam is Shabbos, so likewise when the pasuk by Milah uses the word v'haya la'ois bris, it is indicating that the bris can be done on Shabbos as well. Says the Gemara, Elam Ya'ata, if this is the case, that the word ois was accepted from Har Sinai to be used for this type of Zer Shava, if so, tefillin, tichsiv behen ois. Likewise, tefillin, we find the word ois, v'ayil ois al yadecha, l'tchi Shabbos, there too, preparations for the tefillin should override Shabbos. We could apply this Zer Shava to tefillin as well. Says Gemara, Ella, rather, asya bris bris. We don't learn from ois, rather we use the Zer Shava using the words bris. We find the word bris by bris, v'ayil bris, and we find the word bris by Shabbos. It says there is some bris oilam. So we connect the two things. We say that bris can be done on Shabbos as well. Says the Gemara, if so, why do you limit this allowance of bris on Shabbos only to the Milah B'zmana on the 8th day? What about a gadol? Person who's already 13 years old, and at this point he has his own obligation to do his bris if for some reason it wasn't done earlier. And there is what we find mentioning of this word bris, gadol dechsivei bris. The pasuk says, "Es brisi hefer." This is speaking about the gadol who has neglected to do his bris. So the term bris is mentioned there as well. L'tchi Shabbos, there as well. The bris should be deicha Shabbos, should override Shabbos. One should be allowed to make a bris even on a gadol, on an adult, on Shabbos. Ella, says the Gemara, rather asya doiros doiros. We employ a different Zer Shava using the words doiros doiros. So we have the word doiros by bris. It says kol zochal doiros seichem. We have the word doiros by Shabbos. It says last is Shabbos doiros and bris olam. So we learn from there that the bris can take place on Shabbos. Says the Gemara, if so, tzitzis the chsivei doiros. Likewise, by tzitzis we find the term doiros. It says v'asulam tzitzis al kafik dem lid doirosam. L'tchi Shabbos, there too one should be allowed to make the tzitzis on Shabbos. Ella Amar Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, we don't suffice with just one. Done in ois bris vidoris. We need all three together. We learn the combination of ois and bris and doris, which is found by bris milah, by the bris milah of a katan bismanoi. We learn that from Shabbos, where we also find these three words mentioned, ois bris v'doros, mentioned by Shabbos, and therefore we connect the two things, and the bris will take place on Shabbos. Lafuki hanach, as opposed to all those others mentioned, tefillin and tzitzis, and even the bris of a gadol, the chad chadu d'chsiv behen. In those cases, only one of these things are mentioned. None of them have all three lashonos, all three terms combined. So this is the source of the bris milah, which takes place on the 8th day, that it is the Shabbos. We learn from Zer Shava using the words ois bris and doris found by bris. We connect it to ois bris and doris found by Shabbos to teach us that the bris will take place on Shabbos. Continues the Gemara of Yochanan Amar. We have another source for the bris taking place on Shabbos. Amakra v'yoyim. This is the pasuk mentioned earlier. V'yoyim hashmini yimol b'sar alasai. Why does the Torah need to mention the word uvayoyim? V'yoyim is afilu b'Shabbos, to include even the bris on Shabbos. Amar le Rish Lakish Rabbi Yochanan el miyata. If this is the case that Bayoim includes Shabbos, what about Nechusri Kapara? Those people that were Tamei, the Zav and the Zava, who need to bring a carbon to complete their purification process. So they're in need of a Kapara. Tichsivu Bayoim. There as well, the pasuk says Bayim Hashmini. Hachinami, when we say here too the Dach Shabbos, that those karbanos, even though they're private karbanos, that they're Dach Shabbos, they can be brought on Shabbos. Says the Gemara, Hahu Me'boyle Bayoim V'lei B'layla. That pasuk, by those mechusrei kapara, by those people who are in need of a carbon and of a completion of that kapara, their ubayayim is not superfluous. It's not available. Why? Because that pasuk is needed to teach you that their karbanos can only be brought by day and not by night. So the pasuk is used for that, and it's unavailable. Hi nami, here too by bris the pasuk bayayim perhaps is coming to teach us that meal takes place by day and not at night, and it's not available to include Shabbos. That halacha, that bris must take place by day, is learned from another pasuk. So therefore, the word ubayoyim hashmini is available to teach us even Shabbos. Hi nami, here too, by those tmeim, by b'yom savoisa nafka, We learn the fact that a carbon is required to be brought by day from the pasuk of Yom Tzavoisai. The pasuk says Hashem, the day that Hashem commanded them to bring the karbanos, which implies that the carbon is only brought b'yom. So we learn from there. And the pasuk of Yom Hashmini, by those tmeim, by those mechusik kapara, is indeed available to teach us even Shabbos. Ha'iname b'yom tzavoisai nafka. Says the Gemara, af agav the nafka b'yom tzavoisai. Although generally we learn from this pasuk that a carbon is brought by day, strictly by day, not at night. It's shricha. There is still a need for the Torah to specify by these mechusik kapara, that their carbon needs to be brought strictly by day. Why? Perhaps I would say, perhaps since we find that the Torah expressed concern and care about these people, asuye bedalos, the Torah allowed a special allowance here that they can bring their karbanos bedalos, a pauper's carbon, if they can't afford a more elegant carbon. Torah gives them, Torah staggers the karbanos. If you can't afford, bring a lower level carbon, lower value carbon. And the Torah cares about them, is concerned about them, to allow them, to give them the opportunity to purify themselves. So perhaps since we see the Torah expressed extra care and concern, if so, balayla nami laisi, perhaps I can assume that they can even bring it at night so that they complete their purification process, kamash malon. Therefore, the Torah needs to specifically state, no, even by these mechusrei kapara who need this carbon to complete their tahara process, they cannot bring the carbon at night. And that is the meaning of the word of B'yom Hashmini stated by these fellows. It's coming to exclude nighttime from Havah's karbanos. Therefore, there's no pasuk available to teach us that these karbanos can be brought on Shabbos. Maskef lo Ravina. So Ravina challenged. He says, Ela mi'ata, if this is the case, yehizar kasha ben. If you are working with this attitude that the Torah expresses care and concern for these people, if so, a zar, a non-kohen, perhaps should be qualified, suitable to do the karbanos of these mechusar kapar. Perhaps we don't need to be specific and require a kohen. Likewise, an oinen, a kohen whose close relative passed away on that day, generally he's unfit for avodah. Perhaps he should be allowed to do the avodah, the karbanos of these mechusar kapar, because the Torah expressed a special care and concern regarding these people. Says Gemara, nevertheless, we find that the Torah restores it. We find that the Torah tells us, no, the karbanos of these mechusrei kapara must conform to typical guidelines. They must conform to the halachas of ordinary karbanos. And just as we don't bring them at night, we must bring them with valid kohanim, not with a zar, nor with a oinen. They must conform to standard guidelines, just as all other karbanos. Continues the Gemara of Achabar Yaakov Amar. I have another source for Mila, which is Deicha Shabbos. Amar Kra, the pasuk says Shmini. Ubayom Shmini Yimal. The word Shmini is extra. Shmini afilu b'Shabbos. The 8th day, even if it falls out on Shabbos, you're meant to conduct a bris. Says the Gemara, Shmini is extra. Hi Shmini mibayle. We need the word Shmini to teach us Limutei Shvi, to exclude the 7th day. That's meant to take place on the 8th day, not on the 7th day. Says the Gemara, that Allah we learn from a different pasuk. Shvi. We learn from the pasuk of Shmoynes Yomim, which teaches us the 8th and not the 7th day. Va'akati, but even so, we need it. Why? Chad lemutei shvi. We need the pasuk needs to stipulate the number 8. It needs to do it twice. One lemutei shvi to exclude the 7th day. V'chad lemutei tshi to exclude the 9th day. The michad, because if only one, if the pasuk would only mention it once, I would say shvi. You can't do it on the 7th day because the time has not yet arrived. It's still premature. Perhaps from the 8th day onward, it's considered to be the appropriate time. There's no reason to prefer the 8th day as opposed to the 9th day. So therefore, the Torah needs to repeat it twice. So we have no extra pasuk to teach you. Afilu b'Shabbos. Ella says more rather machavarta. It appears clearly that Rabbi Yochanan's approach is the correct one, that the source, the makar of Mila b'Shabbos is from the word Bayom afilu b'Shabbos. Tani kavas Rabbi Yochanan udeloi kurbacha v'Yaakov. We have a brisa which supports Rabbi Yochanan's approach and not Rabbi Yaakov. The brisa says Shmini Yimoil. We learn from there afilu b'Shabbos. The pasuk says Bayom Shmini Yimoil. We learn from there that even on Shabbos, the assumption is, the premise here is that Mila takes place even on Shabbos. Umani mekayim. If so, how do I fulfill the pasuk which says mechalel moisumas? The one who desecrates Shabbos dies. We apply that b'shar malachis, chutz mila, to other malachis, excluding mila. Mila is meant to take place on Shabbos. That's the working assumption. Oy einay. Now the Brisa reverts. Brisa says, well, perhaps it's not so simple. Oy einay el afilu mila. Perhaps when the Torah does not allow malachis to be done on Shabbos, it is referring to even mila. Umani mekayim shmina yimol. If so, how do I fulfill the pasuk which says that on the 8th day he will have a bris? Chutz mi Shabbos, excluding Shabbos, because mila cannot take place on Shabbos. So the Brisa totally switched tracks. We began with that premise that why shouldn't mila take place on Shabbos? Then the Brisa switched things around. Well, no, mila cannot take place on Shabbos. If so, how do we know that a mila happens on Shabbos? Tamaloima, the pasuk says bayoim, ubayam eshmini. Bayoim is coming to tell you afilu b'Shabbos. So we have a pasuk which teaches us that a mila, which is taking place at the appropriate time in the 8th day, will take place on Shabbos. So indeed, this is a right to Rabbi Yochanan, who derived this halacha from this pasuk. Now let's analyze the wording of the Brisa. The Brisa begins with one approach, then switches midway. Let's try to understand it. Amar Rava, hi Tana, this Tana of the Brisa, mei kora, mai kanichle. Initially, why was he satisfied with making that assumption that Mila takes place even on Shabbos? Ulubasoiv. Then, proceeding with the Brisa, we see Michael Kashile. Why did he have difficulty with that premise? Why did he go ahead and question himself? So what happened here? What made him switch tracks midway? Says the Gemara, Hachikamar. So Rav is explaining, this is what the Tana means to say. Shmini Yima, the pasuk says on the 8th day he will have a bris, afilu b'Shabbos. The working assumption here is, the premise is, that Mila can take place even on Shabbos. Umani mekayim mechaleleo meisumas. And how do I fulfill the pasuk, which does not allow malachis? If one is mechal Shabbos, he incurs punishment, misa. That only applies b'shar malachis, other types of labors, chutz mi mila, aval mila, but mila itself, certainly dachya, has the ability to override Shabbos. So this is the initial opening words, the opening meaning of the Brisa, meaning that we're working with that presumption that mila is superior to Shabbos in this aspect. It overrides Shabbos. Why? Explains Rav as follows. What is this svara based on? My taima kal v'chomeru. It is based on a kal v'chomer. We will learn from the kal v'chomer that mila has the ability to override Shabbos. The kal v'chomer goes as follows. Uma tzora'as shedoiche es ha'avoda. Since we find that tzora'as, if one has leprosy, a nega, and he is tamei, we find that the nega overrides the avoida, the service of the karbanis in the Beis HaMikdash. How is that? Explains Rashi. Let's say it's Erev Pesach, and Yisrael need to bring their karban Pesach, and they are tamei, they are mitzayraim. We don't go ahead and chop off the nega. The Torah says one may not remove the nega. Yishamar benega tzora'as. You cannot remove the nega from a person's body. It's a loisaseh. Now, although it's at the expense of the karban Pesach, the tzora'as negates the carbon. The tzora'as, which is present, overrides the carbon, takes precedence over the carbon. It seems to have superiority over avodah. So since we find that tzora'as is doich avodah, likewise it says if the kohen would like to bring the carbon, he has tzora'as, he's unfit. He can't go ahead and do the avodah. He can go ahead and say, well, I'll remove the nega to allow myself, to enable myself to do the avodah. No, tzora'as is doich avodah. So that's the first link in the chain. We find that tzora'as seems to be superior to avodah. The second link in the chain is va'avodah doiches haShabbos. We find that the avodah has the ability to be doiches Shabbos. Let's take a look at Rashi on the top line here. Va'avodah chamuri. It's stringent. It's chamer. It's superior. Shadoiches Shabbos because it negates Shabbos. B'tmidin musaf and the karbanos tzibur. We find that we bring the karbanos tamid, musaf, all the karbanos tzibur, shezmanam kavua, which have a set time. So you find that the avodah has the power to override Shabbos. So, two links in the chain. We have tzora'as, which is superior to avodah. We have avodah, superior to Shabbos. Now, although tzora'as is so strong that it overpowers avodah, which overpowers Shabbos, mila doicha oisa, nevertheless we find that bris mila has the power to override tzora'as. As we're going to learn in the coming Gemara, if there's a nega in the place of mila, one simply goes and cuts it off. The bris mila, the mitzvah bris, overrides nega. So we find that mila is so powerful It overrides tzora'as, which is stronger than avodah, which is stronger than Shabbos. So certainly, can Mila override Shabbos? Of course. Continues the Gemara, Shabbos shenitchas b'nei avodah. So Shabbos itself, which is negated in the face of avodah, as we learned that karbanos are brought on Shabbos. So it seems to be weaker, so to speak, than avodah. Certainly, einei din shetei Mila doich oisa. Certainly, Mila, which is stronger than them all. It is stronger than tzora'as, which is stronger than avodah, which is stronger than Shabbos. Certainly, Mila can go ahead and directly override Shabbos, and Mila certainly can be done on Shabbos. So this is the kal v'chomer with which the Brisa bases its opening remarks, opening premise on. Certainly, Mila has the power to override Shabbos. If so, what was the rejoinder? Umay oy einay de ka'amar. What is the Tana reverting and saying, well, perhaps not? He's questioning this premise. Hadu Amar. The Tana responded and rejoined and said, well, he said to himself, well, I'm not so sure. I'm uncertain about this conclusion. Umimai de tzora'as chamur. How do we know really that tzora'as is superior, is more chamer than Shabbos? Meaning, we're working with this assumption that tzora'as, since it negates avodah and avodah negates Shabbos, so tzora'as is the superior one amongst these two. So if we face Shabbos and tzora'as against each other, tzora'as is a superior one, and that's the basis of this kal v'chomer. Because if Mila overrides tzora'as, which is stronger than avodah, stronger than Shabbos, then certainly Mila can go ahead and override Shabbos. Well, how do we know that tzora'as is more chamer than Shabbos? Perhaps it's actually Shabbos who's superior to tzora'as. How's that? We might the tzora'as chamur. How do you know tzora'as is more chamer? Then was Shabbos chamer? Perhaps Shabbos is more stringent. Sheken yesh bo einshin v'asaras harbe. Because in Shabbos there are many punishments and many isurim, as opposed to tzora'as, which only carries one isur. Don't cut off that nega. It's only a single isur. So Shabbos actually seems to be superior to tzora'as. Now the fact that if one has a nega, he is unfit for avodah, and we say that the tzora'as sort of pushes away avodah, which pushes away Shabbos. So apparently tzora'as seems to be superior than them all. No, it's not on account of its superiority. How do you know it's because tzora'as is more chamer? Dilma mishum gabru. You know why we won't remove the nega from the person who wants to do avodah? It's not because the tzora'as is more chamer. It stands on a higher footing than avodah. It's simply based on a technical consideration. Because even if you remove this nega, the person is still unfit to do avodah. Why? Explains Rashi, because he needs to be toivel, and he needs to have hair of shemesh. He has to wait for nightfall. In which case the day has already passed. By the time he becomes fit, suitable for avodah, so the day of the carbon is gone. There's no point to remove the nega. How do you know it's on account of the superiority, the chumrah of tzora'as? Because the person is not suitable. So this removes the whole basis of the kal v'chomer. We're working with this assumption that tzora'as is so superior, it negates avodah, which negates Shabbos. So if Mila has the power to override tzora'as, certainly has the power to override Shabbos. No! You're making a wrong assumption. Your conclusion is wrong. Shabbos is really the more stringent one. It has many yisurim, many einshim. The fact that when one has a nega on himself, he cannot do avodah. It's not because tzora'as is stronger than avodah. It's simply merely as a result of it's a circumstantial thing. Since removing of the nega will not enable him to do the avodah on that day. So if so, once we negated our kal v'chomer, the conclusion will be, Umani mekayim shmini imel. If so, how do I fulfill the pasuk which says on the 8th day he should do a milah? Chutz mi Shabbos. It's not including Shabbos, because on Shabbos milah will not be allowed. There's no basis to allow milah. Talmud lo yimar ay b'yoyim afilu b'Shabbos. That's why the Brisa concludes. Okay, we have no more kal v'chomer. Now, indeed, we need to revert to the pasuk. It's an extra word by Yoim to teach us that milah is doicha Shabbos. So in summary, we know that milah is doicha Shabbos. Why? We have several approaches, either through the Gzeres Shava, using the words Ois Bris Doiris, which is present by Bris and is present by Shabbos, to teach us that Bris takes place on Shabbos. We have Rabbi Yochanan who says Bayoim is coming to teach us Afilu b'Shabbos, and we have a Brisa which concurs with this approach. We have Rabbi Bar Yaakov who uses the word Shmini to tell us Shmini Afilu B'Shabbos. This is all according to Rabbanon's approach of things. According to Rabbi Lezer, the Halacha Mishinai is the basis for the Milah being Neicha Shabbos. And from the word B'Yayim, which teaches us Afilu B'Shabbos, he actually learns that the Machshirim, the preparations of the Bris Milah, can take place on Shabbos as well. Continues the Gemara, Tana Rabbanan, we learned in the Bryce. Now we're going to learn the Makar, that Milah is Deicha tzora'as. If there's a nega at the place of the Milah, one goes ahead and performs the Bris Milah, despite the fact that he's going to remove the nega, which is generally a prohibition, a mitzvah loisaseh. One is not meant to go ahead and remove his nega, but Milah overrides that. Tana Rabbanan, Milah Deicha tzora'as. It overrides tzora'as. Bein bezmano, bein shloi bezmano, whether or not the Milah is taking place in its prescribed time on the 8th day, or even Shaloi Bizman is taking place later on, it has the ability to override the nega. Yom Tov, however, Milah, with regard to overriding Yom Tov, it only has the ability to be done on Yom Tov when it is done on the 8th day, and certainly the same halacha applies to Shabbos. How do we know this concept that Milah overrides tzora'as? The Tana Rabbanan, Yimol b'sar alasai, the pasuk that we discussed earlier, on the 8th day, he will have milah to the basar of his arla, and we just assume that it's referring to even when there is a nega at that location. Even though there's a baheres, a nega in that location, he will simply chop it off and do the bris milah. So how do I fulfill the isser of Yishamar b'nega b'tzoras? You meant to safeguard with regard to the nega tzoras, don't get rid of it. You're not allowed to cut it off. How do we fulfill that? That's only when the nega is present in different locations of the body. Chutz milah, except when it pertains to the mitzvah of milah. Because in that case, the milah overrides it. So this is the opening introduction of the brisa, very similar to the previous brisa. The working assumption here is the premise is that milah has the power to override nega. Then the brisa reverts. Begins questioning that assumption. Perhaps not. Perhaps the Torah, which doesn't allow us to chop off that nega, it's referring to even milah. Even when it's at the place of the bris milah, one cannot proceed. How then do I fulfill the directive to do bris milah? When there's no nega present. So perhaps you cannot do a milah at the expense of a nega. Talmud loymar basar. The pasuk says, Yimol psar or lasai, the word psar is extra, coming to teach us. Even though there's a baheres present there, one proceeds with the bris milah at the expense of the nega. So it's a very similar brisa. We began with that premise that yes, milah overrides nega, and concluded, well, we're not so sure about it, and we need a pasuk. And we indeed concluded with a limud from the word basar to teach us that a milah is done even at the expense of a nega. Omar Rava, let's analyze these words. Hi Tana. Well, how do we understand the proceedings of this brisa? The liberation of the brisa. Hi Tana mikora my nichle. Why initially was the Tana satisfied and happy with the premise that milah overrides nega? My kashale. But then later on, why was he questioning that assumption? Hochikamar. This is what the Tana meant to say. Initially he said, Yimo b'sar lasai. When the pasuk directs us to do milah, it's referring to even when it is at the expense of the nega. Even though there's a nega there, you go ahead, remove the nega. Umani mekayim. If so, how do I fulfill the prohibition, the isser, which restricts us from tampering with the nega? Hishama b'nega tzoras. That's only b'shar mekayim. It's chutz milah. It's only when the nega is present in other locations on the body, except when it is at the location of the milah. Aval milah, but when it interferes with milah, doiches tzoras. Certainly the milah pushes away the tzoras. Now, why is that? Why, based on what are we concluding in this manner? My time, and why? Because we have a kavachayim to support this assertion. The kavachayim goes as follows: Uma Shabbos chamura. Since we find that all Shabbos, which is stringent and superior, it has many averis, many onshim. Nevertheless, milah doicha oisa, bris milah has the ability to negate Shabbos. As we concluded earlier, we have a pasuk for that. So if we find that Shabbos, despite its superiority, milah overrides it, certainly it's tzora'as, which is inferior in contrast and proportion to Shabbos. So certainly tzora'as like kol shkein, of course, when we're faced with a choice of doing Mila or tzora'as, certainly the Mila has the ability to b'deicha tzora'as. So that was the assertion, that was the premise that the Tana began, with which the Tana began his discussion. Umay eina deka'amar. If so, what's the rejoinder? What's the response that the Tana challenged? And he said, well, perhaps not. Hada ka'amar, the Brisa responded by saying, the Tana responded by saying, well, perhaps my basis here isn't really so sound. Mimai the Shabbos chamira. How do I really know that Shabbos is the more stringent one, is chamer, when compared with tzora'as? Shabbos is superior, and that's the basis of the Kal V'chomer, because if Mila is Deicha Shabbos, which is superior, certainly it could be Deicha tzora'as. How do I know that Shabbos is chamer? Duma tzora'as chamir. Perhaps it's actually tzora'as who is to be considered more chamer, superior with regard to Shabbos. Why? Because we find shekein doiches avoida, because tzora'as negates avoida, as mentioned earlier. When the kohen, for instance, has a nega and he'd like to do the avoida, which is a mitzvah, he cannot go ahead remove that nega to allow him, to enable him to do the avoida. V'avoida deiches haShabbos, and we find that although tzora'as is superior to avoida, and avoida has the ability to b'deiches Shabbos, as mentioned earlier, that karbanos are brought on Shabbos. So perhaps it's not actually Shabbos who's deemed superior to tzora'as, it's actually tzora'as which is superior to avodah, because we see tzora'as negates avodah, and avodah negates Shabbos. So certainly tzora'as is considered to be on a higher grade than Shabbos. Tamar loima basar. So now that we negated that Kal V'chomer, which was based on the premise that Shabbos is superior, we can no longer have that assumption that Mila, since it's Deicha Shabbos, is Deicha tzora'as. Perhaps tzora'as cannot be negated and overridden by Mila, because tzora'as is superior to Shabbos. So we need a pasuk to allow Mila to take place by a nega. Tamaloima basar. That's why we learn from the pasuk basar afishi yesham baheres. The pasuk is teaching us even when there is a baheres, a nega present at the location of the bris Mila, one proceeds and does the bris even at the expense of the nega. Lishnachrin, another version to explain the deliberations of the Tana. The Tana began by saying, well, Mila deiches tzora'as. Certainly Mila has the ability to negate tzora'as. Why? My time of the osi essay v'deicha leis essay. Because this is a formula employed many times, that essay negates leis essay. When we're faced with a choice of either doing mekayim a mitzvah essay, a positive commandment, or refraining from a mitzvah leis essay, a negative commandment, the mitzvah essay takes precedence and overrides the leis essay. For instance, if one would like to wear tzitzis that feature kilayim woven together, he may do so, although kilayim is a leis essay. But the mitzvah tzitzis, which is an essay, negates and overrides mitzvah leis essay. So Rabban Chumash actually gives a reason for this. He says that mitzvahs essay, positive mitzvahs, are reflective of av, of love to Hashem. They connect us to Hashem. It's an expression of love, as opposed to mitzvahs leis essay, the prohibitions, the negative commandments, which are an expression of yira, fear. We don't want to separate ourselves from Hashem by doing something wrong. And the Ramban says that ava, the sensation of love, is greater, is on a higher level than the sensation of yira, fear, and therefore, when we're faced with a choice of ava and yira, essay, do or don't do, we go ahead and we do, because ava is deicha yira. So this forms the basis of the assertion of the Tana, who began by saying, well, certainly Mila, which is a mitzvah say, can negate the isser of removing of the nega tzora'as, which is a leis hasei, because asay is doicha leis hasei. Again, Mila doiches tzora'as my time. Why the osi asay? Because an essay comes along with dochi and negates and pushes away the leis hasei. So that's the working assumption here, that a Mila can negate the tzora'as. Umay eina deka'amar. If so, why was the Brisa questioning this assumption? Hada ka'amar. And Tana responded by saying, well, perhaps not so sure about it. Why? When do we say the osi essay v'doches leis hasei? When do we employ this rule, this formula, that an essay has the power to override a leis hasei? Leis hasei greater when he is faced with just a leis hasei. Hi, but here by nega, in addition to the leis hasei, we have an essay as well. Hi, essay v'leis hasei. Because the Torah not only warns us against tampering with the nega, in that same pasuk, there's an essay. Be careful to safeguard that nega. Do as you're told. Follow instruction. Don't. We imply from there that don't tamper with it. So it's a positive mitzvah So not only is the Torah warning you don't tamper with it, the Torah is telling you follow instructions. Do as you're meant to do. Safeguard that nega. So we have both things here. A tzora'as entails both elements, essay and lois essay. Now, the essay of bris milah can't go ahead and push over both of them. It can only override a lois essay. We don't find that an essay has the ability to override a lois essay which has an essay together with it. So there goes our whole assumption here, our whole assertion. We cannot assume blindly that the milah will override the tzora'as, which is a very rich avera, very rich isra, has an essay and a lois essay. Umani mekayim. If so, how do I fulfill the pasuk which says yimol b'sar lasai? One is meant to do milah. That's only bizman she'en b'baharis, when there's no nega present there. Ordinarily, sure, you do bris, but not when there's a baharis. Therefore, the Brisa concludes with a pasuk. Tamad loimar. The pasuk says basar, which teaches us v'aval pi she'esh baharis. Even when there is a nega, a baharis present at the makom of milah, we proceed with the milah as usual. So Rava gives us the explanation of these steps, the deliberations of the Brisa, why the Tana began with a davar pashat, with an assumption that milah has the ability to negate baharis. It's either because of a kavachomer. If we find that milah overrides Shabbos, certainly overrides nega, or according to the second version, because milah is a mitzvah saseh and can certainly override nega, which is merely lois saseh. But then the Brisa reverts and questions that assumption. Perhaps it's not so simple. Now, according to the first approach, the Tana is questioning the basis of the kavachomer. You're saying, well, if milah negates Shabbos, which is stringent, surely it can override nega. Well, maybe nega is more stringent than Shabbos. And likewise, according to the second version, the assumption was that a milah negates a nega because essay overrides a lois essay. Well, it's not so simple, because nega also has an essay. So the conclusion is we need to have a pasuk. The pasuk with the word basar, which teaches us that indeed the milah proceeds even at the expense of the nega. Okay, says the Gemara. Tenach gadol dichsid basar. So we understand how we have a source that a milah takes place even at the expense of a nega when it pertains to a gadol, an adult. He's already past 13, where the Torah indeed uses the term basar in the context of his mitzvah. Katanami, likewise a katan, an 8-day-old baby, ksive basar. There too it says basar. What about Beinani, the fellow in the middle? He's past 8 days, but he's not yet a gadol. There's a mitzvah on the father to do the bris at that point as well, even though it's past the prescribed time. Now in that pasuk, in the parasha of Beinani, we don't find the word basar mentioned. Minolan, if so, how do we know that his bris milah as well can override a nega? Amar Abaye. Indeed, we cannot learn it directly. We can't say, well, we find it by gadol, we'll apply it to Beinani. If we find it by katan, we'll apply it to Beinani. We can't do that. But we can use a term called ma'atzad. We find a common denominator, asmi benaya, a joint derivative, a joint derivation. Meaning, migadol le'asya, this fellow who's past 8 days, so it's a milah shaloi bezmana. It's not in its prescribed time. He cannot go ahead and learn from the gadol. Just as the gadol's bris negates nega, overrides nega, his bris should have that ability as well. Why? Because perhaps the bris of the gadol is more prominent. Shekain onish karis, because that bris entails issa karis. If the adult disregards his mitzvah, he gets karis. That's a more stringent form of bris. So perhaps over there, it will have the ability to override a nega, but not the bris of this minor, this katan who's past 8 days old. Likewise, mikatan liasa. He can't learn it from the katan, the 8-year-old baby. Very simple, because shekain milah bezmana, that has an advantage. It's being done in its right time. So perhaps that is considered to be a special bris which can override a nega, but not the bris of the boy who's past 8 days. What is the common denominator between the bris of the katan, of the bris bizmana, and the bris of the gadol? Shekenim moilin. They have a bris, but they have tzora'as, and their bris negates tzora'as, has the ability to override nega. Afkol shenim moilin. Likewise, all those other ones who have a bris, tzora'as, their bris overrides the nega, and that's the source for this Beinani, this katan who's doing it shaloi bezmana past 8 days, but under 13 years old. His bris as well has the power and ability to override a nega. Rava Amar has a different approach for the source of the milah of the shaloi bezmana. He says, look, milah bezmana deicha lo yitzricha kra. We never really needed a pasuk to inform us that the milah bezmana of the 8-day-old child has the ability to negate and override a tzora'as. Why? And the point will be that I'll have an alternate source for the katan bezmani, al kavachomer, and this will leave the word basar mentioned by the katan free and available. Because it's unnecessary for the katan. The katan knows it from elsewhere. So that word can be applied to the beinani, to the katan who's having his mila, shaloi bezmana, the teachers, that his mila as well can override tzora'as. So let's get back to the Gemara. Rabbi tells us that the katan bezmani doesn't need a pasuk. Mikavachomer asya. It can be derived from a kavachomer, which will teach us to allow his bris to override a nega. What is the kavachomer? Uma Shabbos the chamira. Since we find that Shabbos, despite the fact that it's so stringent, it has those isurim, those ancient, nevertheless, doiche, a bris overrides Shabbos, as we mentioned earlier, the pasuk by Yom HaShmini. So since we find that bris overrides Shabbos, which is stringent and superior, tzora'as l'kolshkein, certainly it will override tzora'as, which is inferior relative to Shabbos. So we know that a bris of a katan bezmanai will override tzora'as. The pasuk is available to be applied to a beinani. He just that his bris as well has that ability. Omali Rav Safar Rav Safar challenged Rav Kavachomer. Remind the Shabbos chamira. You're coming to a conclusion based on a kavachomer, based on an assumption that Shabbos is the most stringent amongst the two. How do you know that? Dilma tzora'as chamir. Perhaps tzora'as is actually superior, more chamer to Shabbos. Because we find that tzora'as negates avoida. If the kohen has tzora'as, he doesn't do avoida. We don't remove the nega to enable him to do avoida. Shabbos, and we find that avoida, which is negated by tzora'as, has the ability to override Shabbos. We bring karbanos on Shabbos. So we find at the end of the day that tzora'as seems to be more stringent than Shabbos because we have this double link chain here. Tzora'as negates stronger than avoida. Avoida is stronger than Shabbos. So apparently tzora'as is deemed superior to Shabbos. So there goes your whole kavachomer. What's your kavachomer? If we see that Mila negates Shabbos, which is stringent, certainly it negates tzora'as. Perhaps tzora'as is more stringent than Shabbos. It's considered to be superior to Shabbos. Says no. Hasam, over there, you know why you don't remove his nega to allow him to do the avoida? It's not on account of the chumra of tzora'as. It doesn't indicate superiority. Hasam la mishum the chamir tzora'as. It doesn't indicate that tzora'as is chamer. That's not the reason. Ela mishum the gavad lechazi. It's only simply because the person is not suitable, meaning he's not available to do the avoida. So it's not that tzora'as is superior to avoida, and therefore we conclude it's superior to Shabbos as well. He simply is unable. He's physically, practically unable to do the avodah when he has a nega. But certainly Shabbos is superior to tzora'as. So why is he unable? Simply let him chop off the beharas, the nega, and do the avodah. So what do you mean he's technically precluded from doing the avodah? Says more, even if he removes the nega, he's still lacking tvila. And as Rashi pointed out, even if he's toivel, he needs to wait for the nighttime for Erev Shemesh, which will be past the day of the carbon. There's no point, there's no purpose in removing the nega. It won't enable him to do the avodah. But certainly, Shabbos is superior to a tzora'as, and there forms the basis for Rava's kavachomer. If we find that Mila overrides Shabbos, despite its superiority, certainly has the ability to override a nega. Says the Gemara, is the fact that the reason why you don't remove the nega to enable avodah is simply a circumstantial consideration, not on account of its superiority. Because if you remove it, he'll still remain tamei, etc. That explains why, when he has a nega which is tamei, you won't bother removing the nega to enable him avodah. But negoim ta'ir, what about negoim which are considered ta'ir? Negoim which don't fit into the category of those negoim t'meim. And those negoim, the Rashi brings, one is not allowed to remove them as well. You can't chop them off. But they go ahead and disable the kohen from avodah. They consider to be a mum, a blemish. So they prevent him from doing the avodah. And we don't go ahead and remove that nega to enable him to do the avodah, despite the fact that theoretically removal of this nega will render him suitable for avodah. He's not tamei, doesn't need tefillah, doesn't need Erev Shemesh. So apparently, nega indeed is superior. It's superior to avodah. And we find that nega, which is superior to avodah, and avodah is superior to Shabbos. So apparently, if we place nega against Shabbos, nega is actually considered to be more chamer. And there goes the basis of Yom Kavachomer Rava. Rava says, well, we know that Mila overrides nega because if Mila overrides Shabbos, which is chamer, certainly it can do so by nega. No, nega seems to be more chamer. Look, you don't remove the nega to allow him to do avodah. Elamar Vashi, no. certainly Shabbos is the most stringent amongst the two. It's superior to tzora'as. Why then don't we remove the nega to allow him to do avodah? Hey, Amrina, when do we say the asi essay v'dochi lois hasei? When do we apply the rule that an essay overrides a lois hasei? For instance, in this case, you want to remove his nega to allow him to do the mitzvah of serving the Beis HaMikdash. So the mitzvah hasei of avodah Beis HaMikdash should go and override the mitzvah lois hasei, which disallows, prohibits removing that nega. Right? That was your kasha. Apparently, tzora'as is more chamer because look, he is prevented from doing avodah. We don't go ahead and remove his nega to allow him to do avodah. Now, on what basis would you allow him to remove that nega? Because he wants to proceed and do the mitzvah hasei avodah. And you want to employ the rule of essay doichelos essay, that the power, the positive power of the avodah, the mitzvah hasei, overrides the lois hasei, which prohibits from removing the nega. That won't apply in this situation because it's not taking place simultaneously. At the moment that you're removing that nega, is he doing the avodah? Is he servicing the Beis HaMikdash? No! It's successive. First you're removing the nega, then he'll go do the avodah. We never allow that. We only employ the rule that an essay negates a lois hasei when they're taking place simultaneously. For instance, he's wearing those tzitzis with the kalayim. At that point, the lois hasei is negated, is ignored because his act, his ma'aseh, takes on that positive nature. It's considered to be a mitzvah hasei. So since it's happening at one at the same time, the essay is more powerful. As opposed to this case, you can't just go ahead and remove the nega to allow him to do the avodah later on. They're not happening at the same time. There's no justification. When do we employ this rule that an essay comes and negates a lois hasei? Could go in milah, but tzora'as, for instance, doing a bris milah, when there's a nega, because it's happening simultaneously. The mitzvah hasei of the bris overrides the lois hasei. It takes on a positive note. The act is a mitzvah hasei. Inami, alternatively, another example, tzitzis v'kalayim. When he employs tzitzis to his tzitzis of kalayim, so he wears tzitzis, he's doing mitzvah hasei, despite the fact that it's kalayim, he can do so. The be'idna, the mis'aker lav, at the same moment that the lav is being uprooted and negated, he is establishing the essay. However, in this case of the nega, which is on the coin, be'idna the mis'aker lav, when you're going and disregarding the lav, you're removing the nega and doing the lav. You're not going and establishing. He's not establishing an essay. He's not doing that avodah at the same time. So there's no justification for that. So according to Rav Ashi, yes, indeed, Shabbos is more stringent, is superior to tzora'as. And according to Rav's way of thinking, and therefore we have certainly a kavach chomer, if milah can override Shabbos, it can override tzora'as, which is inferior to Shabbos. Why then do we say that a kohen who has tzora'as, can he not proceed with avodah? Can we remove the tzora'as to enable him to do avodah? Because there's no justification for that. At the point of removal, is he doing it? I say no. So we find no grounds to allow that. Says the Gemara, the Rava of Safra Tanoi. This discussion of whether or not there's a kavach chomer to teach us the halacha that milah overrides tzora'as is actually Tanoi. It's based on machlokes Tanoim. The Sani we learned in the Brayso, basar, the pasuk says basar v'afal pi she'esham baheres imo. Even if there's a baheres, there's a nega there, he does the milah because it overrides the isser of removing the nega. Div Rav Yosha, who learns it from a pasuk. Rav Yosha, we don't need a pasuk. In it's tzarich. Shabbos chamura doicha. If we find that milah can be doicha, can negate and override the Shabbos, which is stringent. Tzora'as like koshkin, certainly it can override the tzora'as, which is less stringent, which is inferior compared to Shabbos. So we have a kavach chomer, which allows us to do the milah even at the expense of tzora'as. So we have the machlokes tanoim whether or not the halacha of milah by tzora'as is based on a pasuk or on a kavach chomer. So in summary, we know that milah negates tzora'as. We have three stages. We have the katan bizmani on the 8th day. We have the katan shaloi bizmani past the 8th day. We have the gadol. What do we know that this concept applies to all three? So the katan bizmani, we have a discussion whether we learn it from basar, that's one shita, or learn from a kavach chomer. If it milah can be deicha Shabbos, certainly can be deicha tzora'as. Regarding the katan who's past the 8th day, we have one approach which says we're going to learn from Atzal HaShava. We find a common denominator between the gadol and the katan. In both cases, the milah is deicha tzora'as. Likewise, by the katan shaloi bizmanai, the same halacha applies. Rava's approach is, well, we have an extra word basar from katan where it's not necessary because it's learned from a kavach chomer. So that word basar is applied to the beinani, to the katan shaloi bizmanai, to teach us that his milah as well is deicha tzora'as. And regarding the gadol, it's very simple and straightforward. That the pasuk there mentions the words basar to teach us that his milah is deicha tzora'as. So in summary, we learned in today's daf that a milah bizmana, meaning on the 8th day, is doiche Shabbos. A milah, whenever it takes place, is doiche tzora'as.